Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy and dive into the darkness. It was the perfect house, a charming, old Victorian home, with creaking floorboards and stained glass windows that cast rainbows in the afternoon sun. Sarah and Mark were thrilled to finally have a place of their own, a fresh start. Yet there was one part of the house they avoided, the attic. Crammed with dusty boxes and forgotten relics, the attic felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. "We'll deal with it later," Mark had said. Sarah agreed, though neither could explain the unease that prickled their skin when they glanced up at the attic door. A week passed before the first sound broke the silence of their new home. It was late, well past midnight, when Sarah heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps creaking the floorboards above her head. She shook Mark awake, her voice trembling. "Someone's in the attic," she whispered. Mark dismissed it, claiming it was the house settling. But night after night, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps pacing back and forth, stopping occasionally as if whoever or whatever it was listening. One stormy night, Mark couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with a flashlight, he climbed the rickety ladder while Sarah clung to the base, her heart pounding. The attic was a tomb of shadows, the air thick with the smell of decay. Mark's flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, revealing boxes, cobwebs, and footprints. Tiny, child-sized footprints pressed into the thick layer of dust, leading to a small, antique trunk in the corner. Mark hesitated, his hand trembling as he opened the lid. Inside was a porcelain doll, its glass eyes cracked, staring blankly ahead. Beside it lay a faded diary. Sarah flipped it open, her breath catching at the words scrawled inside. "Mommy says I can't come out until I'm good, but I'm so lonely. Please play with me." The footsteps stopped that night, but the couple couldn't sleep. They thought they were alone, until the footsteps started again. This time, they weren't confined to the attic. They were coming down the stairs. The house had an undeniable charm, a Victorian beauty that seemed to promise a perfect new beginning for Sarah and Mark. They eagerly unpacked, filling the rooms with laughter and warmth. But one place remained untouched, the attic. It loomed above them, heavy with forgotten memories, sealed by a door neither of them had the courage to open. The first night passed uneventfully, but on the second, Sarah was startled awake by a faint creak above their bedroom. "It's just the house settling," Mark murmured, half asleep. She tried to convince herself he was right, but as the days went by, the noises grew more frequent. A soft creaking, like footsteps, would echo above them late at night. It was never random. The sounds were measured, deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth. Sarah tried to laugh it off during the day, brushing aside the cold dread that gripped her each night. But the sounds wouldn't stop. They started at midnight, growing louder as the hours stretched on. Some nights, the pacing would pause directly above their room, and she could swear she felt the weight of a presence pressing down from above. One stormy evening, the sound of shuffling feet and the faint scrape of something dragging across the attic floor made her heart race. "Mark," she whispered, clutching his arm. "You hear it this time, don't you?" Mark's face was pale, his bravado replaced with unease. "It's just probably an animal," he said, though his voice quivered. That night, sleep eluded them. The footsteps were louder than ever, echoing through the house. It sounded like someone was pacing in frustration, their steps heavy, angry, and then silence. For a moment, relief washed over them, until they heard the slow, deliberate creak of the attic door. The footsteps had become impossible to ignore. Every night, like clockwork, they echoed from the attic, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly human. Sarah and Mark could barely sleep, their nerves fraying with each passing night. "I'm going up there tonight," Mark announced one evening, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound confident. Sarah's eyes widened in protest, but she didn't stop him. She knew they couldn't keep living like this. Armed with a flashlight, Mark pulled the attic door open. The ladder creaked under his weight as he ascended, each step a test of courage. Sarah stayed at the bottom, clutching her phone, ready to call for help. The air in the attic was thick and suffocating, filled with the stale smell of decay. Mark's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating boxes piled high with old books, broken furniture, and forgotten trinkets. The beam wavered as his hand shook, and then he saw them. Footprints. Small, child-sized footprints etched into the thick layer of dust on the floor. They weren't random. They formed a trail, leading deeper into the shadows. Mark followed them, his breath catching with every step. The footprints stopped in front of an antique trunk, its surface marred by scratches as if someone, or something, had tried desperately to claw it open. He hesitated, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Sarah could hear it downstairs. With trembling hands, he unlatched the trunk and opened it. Inside lay a porcelain doll, its face cracked, one glass eye missing. It stared up at him with a lifeless gaze. Beside it was a diary, its pages yellowed with age. Mark flipped it open to the first page and froze. "Mommy locked me here because I was bad. I'm sorry. Please let me out." Mark slammed the trunk shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But before he could move, the footsteps began again, this time circling him. Downstairs, Sarah heard the ladder creak, but Mark never came down. Mark stood frozen, staring at the trunk in disbelief. The porcelain doll, its face cracked and weathered, seemed to gaze back at him with lifeless eyes, a chilling reminder of the horrors lurking within the walls of this house. The diary, its pages yellowed with time, trembled in his hands as he read the words scrawled in faded ink. "Mommy locked me here because I was bad. I'm sorry. Please let me out." He slammed the trunk shut with a force that echoed through the attic, his pulse racing. But as he stood there in the dim light, the air thickened, and an overwhelming sense of dread flooded his chest. The footsteps above him, once confined to the attic, had stopped. Then something else caught his attention. A soft, slow creak. It was coming from behind him. The footsteps, no longer confined to the attic, were now moving across the floorboards above them, dragging through the house, moving closer, as if whatever had once lingered in the attic was now coming for them. Mark's heart dropped to his stomach as the realization hit him. The presence was no longer upstairs. He rushed to the ladder, calling down to Sarah. "We need to leave now." But the sound of heavy footsteps marching toward the stairs froze him in place. The heavy creak of the attic door was unmistakable. The figure, something that had been confined to the attic for years, was now descending, moving through the house like a dark shadow. Sarah, hearing the panic in Mark's voice, rushed up to the attic. But before she could reach the top of the ladder, the air turned icy cold. The footsteps stopped right at their bedroom door. From behind the door, she could hear the soft scraping of something, someone dragging slowly across the floor. She hesitated, her breath shallow, and then the door creaked open by itself. The room was empty, except for the sound of a child's soft giggle, echoing from the dark corner. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Maria had finally moved out of her parents' house and into a small, cozy apartment near her college. The space was perfect for her, simple, quiet, and intimate. But there was one feature of the apartment that felt strange. The windows. They were large, stretching from floor to ceiling, framed by thick, floor-length curtains in deep, dark green. Maria didn't mind them at first. In fact, they felt comforting, offering privacy and a sense of seclusion. At night, she would close them tightly, sealing herself off from the outside world. She liked the way they blocked the city's bustling noise and harsh lights, creating a cocoon of silence. But something about them bothered her, even though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. She felt an odd pressure when she stood too close to the curtains, as if they weren't just heavy fabric, but something watching, waiting. Still, she pushed the thought aside. She was being paranoid, just nerves from settling into a new place. The first night was uneventful. Maria unpacked, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window, the curtains drawn, feeling safe in the quiet darkness of her new home. But on the second night, the whispers began. Soft at first, just a faint murmur she could barely make out. Maria assumed it was her imagination, the hum of city life bleeding through the walls. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the whispers seemed closer, as if someone were standing right behind the curtains. It was so distinct, so real, that Maria jumped in her seat. She stood up, her heart pounding, and carefully peered out from behind the fabric, expecting to find someone, maybe a neighbor playing a prank. But there was no one there. Confused and unsettled, Maria chalked it up to a draft, some fluke of the apartment's old windows. She shut the curtains tighter and went to bed, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get her attention from the other side. She couldn't understand it. She hadn't heard a thing during the day. But as night fell and the silence of the apartment deepened, the whispers would return. And with each passing night, they became more distinct. At first, Maria convinced herself it was nothing more than her mind playing tricks. The whispers, though unnerving, were so faint, so indistinct, that she could easily brush them off as the wind or the creaking of the building settling. But deep down, something tugged at her, telling her that wasn't the case. Night after night, the whispers returned. At first, they were faint, like the distant sound of muffled voices. Nothing to be alarmed about. But the more she listened, the more she noticed. The voices seemed familiar. There was a soft, almost comforting rhythm to the murmurs, as if someone was trying to have a quiet conversation. A low, almost unintelligible hum that reverberated through the walls. And always, it came from behind the curtains. Maria tried to ignore it. She told herself it was the stress of school getting to her, maybe a trick of the wind, or perhaps her mind conjuring up sounds from the city outside. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, closer. They began to feel deliberate, as if they were directed at her, calling her name. Maria, her blood ran cold the first time she heard it. The voice was faint but distinct, a whisper that sent a chill down her spine. She leapt up, heart pounding, and tore back the curtains. Nothing. The room was empty, the night air still and silent. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed. The whispers had stopped, and for a moment, she thought she had imagined it all. But then, just as she turned to walk away, the voice came again, this time clearer, louder, almost urgent. Maria. It was followed by a second voice, a deeper, darker tone. Come closer. A knot tightened in Maria's chest. She couldn't understand it. Her mind raced. Was someone else in the apartment? Was it a neighbor playing a sick joke? But then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of something brushing against the fabric of the curtains. A slow, deliberate movement, like someone or something was standing just behind them. Her breath caught in her throat. The whispers weren't just noises anymore. They were alive, and they were calling her. Maria couldn't take it any longer. The whispers had become impossible to ignore, their presence now a constant hum in the back of her mind. Every night, they grew louder, closer, so close, she could almost feel the breath of whoever, or whatever, was behind the curtains. The voices called her name again, and the shiver down her spine was no longer from the cold. It was fear. Enough was enough. With trembling hands, Maria moved toward the curtains, her pulse hammering in her ears. She hesitated only for a moment before she grabbed the fabric and yanked it back. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The curtains fluttered as she tugged them aside, and as she turned her gaze to the window, a cold wave of dread swept over her. At first, she saw nothing. Then she saw the marks. Claw-like scratches marred the surface of the window glass. Deep, jagged lines that seemed to have been etched with incredible force. The marks ran across the glass, as if something had scraped its nails, desperate to get inside. Maria gasped, stepping back, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She pressed her hand to the cold window, her reflection staring back at her. But something was wrong. Something was moving. She squinted, her vision blurring with fear, and then she saw it. A shadow, dark, formless, pressed against the other side of the glass. It was tall, hunched, its outline faint but unmistakable. And then, as if sensing her gaze, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head to face her. Her blood ran cold. A pair of pale, empty eyes stared back at her through the glass, wide and hollow. The figure tilted its head to the side, its movements unnatural, almost mechanical. It didn't blink. It didn't move away. It just stared. Maria staggered backward, knocking over a lamp in her haste to escape the suffocating grip of terror. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled for her phone, calling the landlord, the police, anyone who could help her, but the line was dead. The apartment was silent, the whispers gone, but the figure outside remained, and it wasn't leaving. The next night, Maria lay in bed, wide awake, waiting for the whispers to return. Her heart raced with every breath she took, each minute stretching into what felt like hours. But the whispers never came. The apartment, once filled with their sinister murmurs, was now eerily silent. The oppressive air that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Maria tried to calm herself, convincing herself that it was finally over. Perhaps it had all been a figment of her imagination, a trick her mind had played on her after the stress of moving and settling into a new place. Maybe she was just exhausted, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence dragged on, heavy and suffocating. Maria slowly drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams plagued by the image of the shadowy figure with its hollow eyes. She woke suddenly, the room bathed in the pale light of the morning. Something felt off. The bed felt too cold. The air was thick with the remnants of dread, and a sense of panic started to claw at her chest. And then she saw it. The curtains, those thick, heavy curtains, were wide open. Her heart stopped. She had locked the windows tightly before bed. She was sure of it. She had checked them twice, making sure there was no way anyone could have entered. Yet, though they were wide open, the gust of wind causing them to flutter slightly in the breeze. Maria sprang out of bed, rushing to the window. Her hands shook violently as she checked the lock. It was secure. She stared outside, searching for any sign of someone, any explanation for how this could have happened. But there was nothing. And then the whispers came again, faint at first, like the softest breath against her ear, but then clearer, louder. Maria, the voice was back, and this time it was inside the apartment. Jason had always been the kind of guy who liked a bit of solitude. Moving into a small boarding house on the edge of town seemed like the perfect decision. It was quiet, affordable, and the room was just big enough for his needs. The house itself was old, with creaky floors and an odd, musty smell that lingered in the hallways. But to Jason, it felt like a place where he could escape from the hustle and bustle of his day-to-day life. There was one thing about the house that always caught his attention, though: the hallway light. It flickered. At first, Jason didn't think much of it. The bulb was probably old, he reasoned. But as the days went by, the flickering grew more persistent, as if the light itself were struggling to stay on. Every time he walked down the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The shadows it cast on the walls seemed to move with a life of their own, shifting and stretching in odd directions. Jason brushed it off as his imagination, attributing it to the late hours he often kept. But there was something unnerving about the way the shadows seemed to linger just a little longer than they should, as if they were waiting for him to walk by. One night, as he made his way to the bathroom, the flickering light above him cast a long, dark shadow at the far end of the hall. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as he took a step forward, the shadow stretched longer, reaching toward him, almost as if it were following his every movement. Jason froze in place. He could feel his heart rate quicken, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The shadow was no longer just a vague outline. It was the figure, a dark silhouette, standing still at the end of the hall, staring directly at him. And then the light flickered again, and the figure seemed to vanish. Jason tried to forget the strange figure he'd seen that night. It seemed impossible to explain, just a trick of the light, perhaps, or his tired mind playing games. He told himself it was nothing, but night after night, the shadow returned. It always appeared around midnight, when the house was at its quietest. Jason would be lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the soft hum of the house settling around him. And then, in the quiet darkness, he'd hear it, the faint creak of the hallway floorboards beneath someone's weight. Every time, he would look toward the door. The shadow was there. It stood motionless at the far end of the hall, just beyond the faint glow of the flickering light. Jason could barely make out its form, but he could feel it, something dark, something wrong, looming in the corridor. It wasn't just a shadow. It had depth, as if it were a presence waiting, watching. Jason was no longer sure if he was imagining it. The shadow had been there so many times now, at the exact same spot, that it seemed impossible it was all in his head. But whenever he mentioned it to the other tenants, they would stare at him blankly, as if he were speaking a foreign language. "There's nothing there," one of them had said, dismissively. "Must be the light playing tricks on you," another suggested. But Jason knew what he saw. He could feel it deep in his gut, a sense of dread that crept up his spine every time he walked past the hall. The shadow never moved, not once. It simply lingered, just out of reach, like something waiting for the right moment to step forward. One night, unable to take it any longer, Jason decided to confront it. He left his room and walked down the hallway, every step a battle against the rising panic that clawed at his chest. As he approached the end of the hall, he could see it again, the shadow, standing perfectly still. Only this time, it wasn't just waiting. It was slowly turning toward him. Jason's breath quickened as he stood frozen at the end of the hallway. The shadow wasn't just waiting for him anymore. It was moving, slowly, methodically. It inched toward him, the darkness spreading like ink across the floor, creeping closer with every heartbeat. The air around him grew thick, suffocating. A bone-chilling cold pressed in from every direction, the kind of cold that sank deep into your skin and made you feel as though you would never be warm again. Jason tried to back away, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Panic rose in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. His heart pounded in his ears as he realized that the shadow was not just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was coming for him. With every step the shadow took, the temperature dropped, making his breath fog in the air. His hands shook uncontrollably as he turned and ran, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of fear that wrapped around him. He dashed toward the front door, yanking at the handle, but it didn't budge. The door was locked, but he was sure he had left it unlocked. Panic surged again, his mind racing for any possible explanation. Maybe it was just stuck. Maybe the lock was jammed. He pulled harder, his muscles straining, but the door wouldn't open. The sound of footsteps behind him made him freeze. They were slow, deliberate, heavy like the weight of something ancient and powerful. His breath came in sharp gasps as he spun around, expecting to see the shadow looming behind him. But there was nothing. No figure. No darkness. Jason's eyes darted around the hallway. It was empty, save for the flickering light and the oppressive cold that still hung in the air. The shadow had vanished, but the fear didn't. Desperately, he rushed to the back door, the same cold fear gnawing at him, telling him that something was terribly wrong. He pulled on the handle with all his strength, but it too was locked. Frantic now, Jason stumbled back into the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the weight of something watching him, waiting for him to break. And then, the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. The exits that once seemed so close were now impossible to reach. The walls closed in on him as he ran in circles, every turn leading him back to the same spot, the end of the hall. The shadow was there again, waiting. This time, Jason couldn't escape. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled backward, his mind spinning with terror. The hallway had changed. What once seemed like a simple corridor was now a labyrinth, twisting, warping, bending in ways that defied logic. The walls stretched, the floorboards creaked beneath him as if the house itself were alive, closing in on him. The shadow was everywhere, pressing in on him from all sides. It surrounded him, the oppressive cold and the suffocating darkness blotting out the flickering light. Jason couldn't think clearly anymore. His thoughts were fragmented, scattered, like pieces of a broken puzzle he couldn't put together. He had to escape, but no matter how many doors he tried, no matter how many windows he broke open, the house refused to let him leave. The exits had vanished, swallowed by the darkness. The walls were alive, shifting with the pulse of something malevolent. Then, through the fog of panic, a voice echoed in his mind, a voice from somewhere deep within the house. Jason! He spun around, but no one was there. Jason! The voice was clearer now, and it wasn't just a whisper. It was a guttural rasp, like a long-forgotten soul trapped in the walls. And then, the truth hit him like a sledgehammer. The boarding house was condemned. Years ago, it had been deemed unsafe for habitation, shut down after a string of strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, and reports of the very same shadow that haunted Jason. He had moved in, unaware, oblivious to the house's dark past. The house, it seemed, was alive with the spirits of those who had come before him, trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. Jason was not the first to suffer. He wouldn't be the last. He was a victim, trapped just like all the others. The walls trembled around him, as if the house was laughing. The flickering light above him dimmed to nothing, plunging the hallway into complete darkness. And then, the shadow stepped forward, its form now unmistakable, a tall, twisted silhouette with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. It was time. Jason screamed, but his voice was lost in the suffocating silence of the house. The shadow was not his only fear now. The house itself was hungry, and Jason had just become its newest prisoner.